Nō mai, haere mai, welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is a Global Insight Special. Global Insight first aired in November 2018. Now, here at the end of 2022, we want to reflect on 100 episodes of Global Insight. Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
The first Global Insight, it focused on the South American migrant caravan.
Yeah.
Thousands of desperate South Americans trying to get into the United States. Let's take a look at a clip from that first episode. We're seeing extraordinary scenes in South America at the moment, with the so-called migrant caravans of several thousands of people who have moved up from Central America, have reached Mexico City and beyond, and say that they're not going to stop until they're across the US border. Robert, what's going on?
Good afternoon, Bruce. Well, what's happened is that we have about 5,000 people who've left Honduras. Originally it was a party of about 1,000 people, and it's gathered this caravan, this group of people who are seeking a better life, have moved progressively through Guatemala into Mexico, with apparently the destination being the United States.
That was a significant event, being as it was during the era of US President Donald Trump and his talk about building this physical wall between the North and South Americas. For 4 years, every fortnight, Global Insight has shone a light on hotspots around the globe. But why should New Zealanders care about what happens overseas?
I think the reasons are self-interest, essentially. The core reason is self-interest. New Zealand prosperity and its well-being depends on exports, and about 29% of New Zealand's gross domestic product is exported. That's 29% of what we produce, essentially, and they're largely agricultural exports. And so our well-being depends on exports, and that means in turn that we depend on what's called an international rules-based order. That enables us to trade, that framework enables us to trade with more than 100 countries. So New Zealanders have a huge stake in being informed on what's going around, what's happening in the world. We make our living through selling to the world, particularly agricultural produce, and we are deeply affected by what's happening in the world. And so, in a sense, to answer your original question, why should we care? Because we're affected by the outside world, whether we like it or not, and therefore we have a big interest in trying to shape that environment which affects us.
On Friday, March 15, 2019, we recorded a Global Insight special. While the details about the Christchurch mosque terror attacks were still emerging.
Yeah.
As we speak, at least one gunman has killed or injured up to 30 people in a central Christchurch mosque. There's also been a shooting at Linwood Mosque in East Christchurch. Robert, thanks for coming in at short notice.
Well, you're welcome.
This sort of thing happens in France or the United Kingdom, not here. How are we to understand it?
Well, to this point it hasn't happened here, and this is a dreadful, shocking act of terrorism, which many of us wouldn't expect to happen here, but I think it is a stark reminder that the world is interconnected and that we're not immune from this trend of terrorism, violence that we've seen elsewhere in the world.
That was an unprecedented event in New Zealand's history, and it brought us to global attention for all the wrong reasons. How, since then, has New Zealand's place in the world changed?
I think in two senses. I think there was a tendency up to this appalling Christchurch terror attack to think there was a sense of New Zealand exceptionalism. We felt because of our relative geographical isolation, we were not subject to the same trends that affect the rest of the world. I think the Christchurch terror atrocity ended that assumption. We realised that we are affected by transnational terrorism and also violent, if you like, extremism. And I think the other thing that was interesting is that while you were right, we found ourselves in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. I think the response of the New Zealand government under Jacinda Ardern was widely admired around the world. It was a combination of empathy for the victims and their families, but also a willingness to take decisive action. The banning of automatic weapons, the launching of the Christchurch call, the attempt to curb online extremism. So I think New Zealand's position in the world changed quite significantly. In a sense, politicians here like to describe ourselves as a small state. I think in the eyes of the rest of the world, we became a minor power.
I clearly remember in February 2020, you and I discussing this concerning pandemic that was emerging centred on Wuhan in China. And you offered the opinion that this disease outbreak could potentially change world history. This virus has very obvious and serious health implications. It also has a political dimension. How is the politics of coronavirus playing out in China?
Well, analysts sometimes describe unanticipated events as black swan events, and they can make or unmake governments. So there's numerous examples of this. For example, the Pearl Harbor attack was an event which apparently came out of the blue for the United States and led to the United States entering the Second World War. We then saw a nuclear reactor accident in the former Soviet Union in 1986, which certainly increased the divisions within the Soviet leadership and radicalized Mr. Gorbachev into taking a position that the Soviet Union must reduce the cost of Cold War competition with the United States. And now we have this coronavirus event, which does have the potential to further test the legitimacy of the communist leadership led by Xi Jinping.
What lessons from the Covid-19 pandemic are still waiting to be learnt by the global community?
I think we've partially learnt some of them, but the lesson is incomplete. I think many of us have become aware of how interdependent we are within our respective societies. That is, the nurses, the taxi drivers, the refuse collectors, all those people who don't hit the headlines. We realise all of us critically depend on them. So I think there's a growing awareness amongst many people, particularly young people, how interdependent we are as a society amongst on each other. But globally, I think the same lesson applies. This is a problem, COVID-19, which is still with us, which doesn't recognise borders, and it clashes with the way we've often viewed international affairs, which is in a compartmentalised, state-centric fashion. So we haven't yet come to terms, I think, with fully absorbing those lessons. We're on the way, but at the moment there is a mismatch, Bruce, between this pandemic and the way our world's organised to deal with it. We haven't got a global public health infrastructure, for example. So at the moment, because we're dealing with this problem in a piecemeal way, we're doomed to suffer mutations. So we haven't really got to grips with the problem yet.
The United Kingdom leaving the European Union was big news for a long time. On a Brexit episode of Global Insight, towards the end of 2020, you suggested that New Zealand couldn't trust British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and this episode was shared globally and viewed 500,000 times.
Only in the last 7 days we've seen a very disturbing development where the Johnson government in the UK is proposing to renege on an international treaty, the withdrawal agreement that they signed in January with the EU. Now this is a very disquieting development because it raises questions for a country like New Zealand. We're in the process of negotiating a free trade agreement. Britain, at the moment, under the Johnson government, is proposing to renege on an agreement it's just made with 27 liberal democracies in the EU. That's bad news. How can we be confident that the Johnson government is going to honour any international agreement with us?
2 years on, Brexit doesn't look to be going so well for the United Kingdom, and Boris Johnson is no longer Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Have we seen the end of nationalist, populist leaders?
I think the answer is no, but I think their status or profile is diminishing. And I think the reason was, Brexit in many respects was a symbol of national populism. It was based on false promises. And once in office, the populists like Johnson had the chance to put their promises into practice. They delivered a so-called oven-ready Brexit, but the promise of Brexit was not delivered. In fact, Britain has gone from the 5th largest economy to the 7th world largest economy, and more than 2 trillion in British sterling has left the country in flight. So in a sense, there is tremendous disenchantment now with Brexit in the UK. This has had ripples globally. Mr. Trump has lost the election in 2020. Mr. Bolsonaro another populist lost the election in 2022. And we've also seen the election deniers, these populists who supported Trump, who tried to overturn the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. They also did very badly in the US midterms. So I think I have a sense that the tide is turning against national populism, but we're seeing it surface here, Bruce. Recently we've had a tragic case involving a young baby that needed an emergency operation. And you had a number of people, high-profile people, like Liz Gunn and Sue Gray, a lawyer, basically taking up the populist cause on behalf of the family and effectively denying science.
One of the biggest world events of this year has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We spoke on the day that invasion really got going on February 24.
There's 45 million Ukrainians, and they seem absolutely determined to resist Russia. So I think he's walking into a hornet's nest. Many Russian, it's not just, if you listen to the criticisms coming from senior Russian military officials, some of them are deeply concerned about the situation. As one said, this invasion will not be a tea party, and another one said it will be catastrophic for Russia. So what we may be looking at is a drawn-out conflict which will have terrible consequences in people terms, the loss of life, and it will drain the resources of both Ukraine and Russia. And I think you'll have a lot of outside powers, not least in Eastern Europe, supporting Ukraine because they believe their fate as democracies are linked to the survival of Ukraine as a democracy.
Here at the end of 2022, after 100 episodes of Global Insight, how has Putin's invasion of Ukraine reshaped the world?
I do think it's a defining moment in the evolution of the global order, but so far, although the Ukraine has defied expectations and done very well, we can't say definitively the result at this stage. I still think Ukraine will prevail in 2023. What are the outcomes, or what are some of the implications so far? I think one of the major implications is that NATO and liberal democracy have been reinvigorated by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And on the other side of that particular coin, authoritarianism has basically suffered a big blow. Not just is the Putin regime in trouble in Russia, but in China, we've seen the authoritarian regime there struggle, and China offered tacit support for the invasion. And in Iran, another authoritarian state, there's been widespread protests. So I think these are significant spin-offs. We've also, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine confirmed something that we already knew, which is the world is inherently and inextricably interconnected. We've had, because of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, we've seen shortages in terms of fuel and also food. And I think that brings home to people, this is not just a little local conflict somewhere in Europe, it affects the whole world. I think another big implication of the conflict is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine showed once again that the UN Security Council is not fit for purpose and is not a barrier to conflict in the world, not least because 5 members of the UN Security Council can block anything they don't like. And on this occasion, it was Russia which impeded any condemnation of its illegal activity.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
It's been an excellent first 100 episodes of Global Insight.
Thank you, Bruce.
And thank you for watching. Have a peaceful and joyful Christmas season, and catch us next year for more Global Insight. Te pono, me te araha.